Good afternoon, everyone. I have with me Robert Felix. You know him as the author of Not by Fire, but by Ice. He runs the website Iceagenow.info, where you can find an enormous amount of information on our changing climate. In addition, he's also written the book Magnetical Reversals and Evolutionary Leaps, which is timely as well because the magnetic excursion on our planet. These two books alone will explain all of the changes going on our planet at this moment in time. The intensification of the grand solar minimum, the cycles in our sun, the galactic cosmic rays, Birkeland currents, the electrification of our atmosphere and the telluric currents on our Earth's surface, and how this is going to affect all of us. It is literally a reset button for society. Looking back through the cycles of history, crop production has a very difficult time holding on in these cooler conditions. And our planet is starting to cool. And the global media is in damage control now, trying to explain that, the last 30 years that we've told you of information is actually not really correct. Robert, I am so grateful that you're with me so we can try to explain some of these changes coming forward, because as electromagnetic beings, we all feel something's just not right at the moment. And I have a great feeling that's connected to the sun, electromagnetically through our solar system and what we're experiencing on Earth. So telluric currents, not a lot of people have heard of those, but people have heard of ley lines. And we're talking about ancient cultures. It seemed that a lot of the megaliths that were built were on the intersections of these ley lines, or at least marking out where these energy grids are on the planet. Talking about cosmic rays as well, a lot of peer-reviewed research in the last 3 years coming out pinpointing that these cosmic rays excite magma chambers, specifically silica-rich magma chambers. And this is where we get into these larger volcanic eruptions, year without a summer. And it seems the ones that are on the equatorial bands have a much more grandiose effect, cooling the atmosphere than the more regional, more northerly type of eruptions. So you're in Washington. If you have a Cascadia eruption, it's not going to have the cooling punch that something down along the Indonesian chain or Papua New Guinea chain would have. But it's all based on cosmic rays. So you can start to see how many effects our weakened magnetosphere moving into the future.
But when you're talking about the cosmic rays triggering the volcanoes and the magma chambers, and I'd like to interject here about the underwater volcanoes, because
please do.
Because, when I started writing Not by Fire, but by Ice, when I started writing that in 1991, scientists thought there were probably 10,000 underwater volcanoes in the entire world. That's what they thought there were, and they thought they would have nothing to do with the climate. Well, then in 1993, they discovered another 1,100 underwater volcanoes off the coast of Easter Island. They didn't even know had been there. So they increased the world supply of underwater volcanoes by 10% in just a matter of months. But still, the scientists said that, underwater volcanoes can't possibly affect the climate. Now that was in 1993. Now NASA estimates that there are probably more than 3 million underwater volcanoes, and yet I still hear them saying that they would have nothing to do with the climate. 3 million underwater volcanoes, and those things, they're not all active today, but so many of them, they figure that probably more than 100,000 of them are active, and they are pumping magma into the seas that's more than 2,000 degrees hot. I mean, how can we possibly think that they're not affecting the climate? But what I see is that as our magnetic field weakens, that volcanic activity on land, such as the Cascadia zone that you're talking about, that volcanic activity on land increases, which means that it's cooling the skies. But at the same time, where we can't see it, that the underwater volcanic activity increases, that starts to heat the oceans, and that, of course, causes more evaporation. And so that evaporation, that moisture climbs into the skies that have been cooled by above water volcanoes, and you've got an ice age. And that's, I mean, let's face it, that's where the moisture comes from to create those huge sheets of ice in Canada. During the last ice age, most of Canada was covered by 2 miles of ice, but at the same time, sea levels were about 400 feet lower than they are today. That's where the all of the moisture comes from to build those ice sheets. Indonesia was actually connected to the mainland, and it was almost connected to the Philippines. Indonesia was the size of a huge continent just during the last ice age, and that's going to happen again. In the United States, Florida was twice as big as it is today. New Jersey, the shoreline was 100 miles further east than it is today. So I see that is going to be happening. So, by the way, when I hear all of this talk, all this malarkey about rising sea levels, well, of course sea levels are rising. Sea levels have been rising for the last 11,000 years, ever since the Ice Age ended. And I expect to see them going down again. In 2010, sea levels declined slightly. In 2011, sea levels declined slightly. In 2016, sea levels declined slightly. So, I expect we're going to be seeing more and more sea level decline as we enter into the Ice Age.
To go out on a side note here, with those lower ocean levels, I'm wondering what types of cities from the previous civilization, because I am in firm belief, now you can agree or disagree, it's just my opinion, it's my firm belief that there was a prior civilization, perhaps even two, that were at least as advanced in our own technology, if not higher, using different types of energy systems. But think about that. If they're coastal, where do we build our cities today? We build them next to rivers. We build them next to coasts. If you look around each continent, the heaviest area of density and population is along the coastal areas. So imagine if that coast moves, like you're talking 100 miles, that's 160 kilometers. And it's in an area in depth that we as recreational scuba divers can't even get to. At 130 feet, you need to decompress for how long? But you're talking about something that's 300-400 feet underwater. What is the Navy mapped sonar-wise out there? You talked about the studies, well, how did they come up to the conclusions of how many new volcanoes they discovered? It's because of the underwater mapping technology and the 3D sonar, which has gotten so good. I'm just really curious what they have found off the coasts of our continents from the previous, I should say, civilization, because at that point, the Ice Age and the increasing ice would have wiped them out. I don't care how technologically advanced you are. Climate is going to win every single time. And we are so fragile right now. And our electrical grids are so fragile, but these systems and cycles of Earth, building and cleansing and repeating and rinse and repeat over hundreds of thousands of years has started again. And I don't know what we're going to do with our food supply. It all comes back to that same thing again.
It does, back to that food supply. And I don't know that we have time to do anything about it. Well, during little ice ages, that's one of the things that happened during the 1600s. That's why so many witches were burned at the stake. Is in Europe, they would have huge hailstorms that wiped out the crops. And of course, as we're doing today, they wanted to blame humans. So they would blame the local, quote, witch and burn her at the stake. There's a astrophysicist, Sally Baliunas, out of Harvard, that she, somewhere on my website, I've got a video when she's talking about it, but she figures that 50,000 people, 50,000 so-called witches, were burned at the stake during the Little Ice Age because the crops were being destroyed and they had to blame it on somebody. And now, of course, we're trying to blame it on humans again. But if a farmer loses his entire crops for a couple of years in a row, he's probably got his whole farm mortgaged, and all of a sudden he can't make his payments, and he's going to go out of business. And he's not going to have time or the money or the wherewithal to suddenly move a couple 100 miles south in order to start a new farm. So And so much of our world is based on just-in-time delivery, which I don't blame them. That's how it has to be. But I don't know if we have time to correct that. I'm going to suggest that people better have their own garden. They might want to have their own greenhouse, and certainly find a way to protect it from huge hailstorms. But I think it's going to be everybody for themselves, and you better have your own way of having your own food supply.
From your previous studies looking into how far south did the weather change enough to shift growing zones? Do you have any information on that in terms of, you've delved so deeply into, where the edges of these weather fronts or ice fronts or climatic fronts or just change fronts would have stopped? They've only progressed so far south, because you talked about certain regions of the planet, the tropics, the semi-tropics, remained relatively the same with smaller temperature decreases. So where, in your opinion, do you see growth zones shifting where it might, where's the edge of one that is, for an example, Canada is going to go completely offline, in my opinion, for growing wheat. And Heilongjiang in China is going to go completely offline to literally almost zero. So one of these parts on the planet that you consider a major grain producer, such as northern China, they're going to get another drought that comes with this and the cold, and they will just not be able to grow this wheat. So where does it leave us with the edge of these zones?
Some of the areas this might be counterintuitive, but during the last ice age, most of Alaska was not covered with ice because it's surrounded by ocean, and so I know it's a very big place. I've lived there, but most of Alaska was not covered by ice, so that should be okay. In the United States, the ice descended into the United States. Seattle was covered by about 4,000 feet of ice, 4/5 of a mile straight up. But the ice only went as far south as Olympia, as the state capital of Washington. If it had been 100 miles south of Olympia, it would have only been about 5 to 6 degrees colder than it is today. They could tell that by seeing the kind of plants that grew there at the time. So Seattle is covered. The ice extended across toward Spokane. Spokane was not covered, but it was covered with a giant lake. Coeur d'Alene was not covered. Then the ice essentially followed the Missouri River. So if somebody's looking at a map and look at the Missouri River, on the north side of the Missouri River, there were cliffs of ice about 15 stories tall. But south of the Missouri River, you could have survived. I've many years ago, I lived in Juneau, Alaska, and there's the Mendenhall Glacier right there. And I lived in an apartment that was just maybe a half a mile in front of the glacier. You can survive near a glacier as long as you're not under it. All of New England, every part of it was covered with ice. New York City was covered with ice. In fact, the ice extended out to Long Island. Long Island is essentially built as the terminal moraine of that ice sheet. But Chicago was covered, but one other thing that I've read is that essentially the climate of Chicago moved to Georgia, to Atlanta. So, in the last few years, I've been seeing Atlanta get more and more snowstorms. So I'm thinking that's it. But even if Atlanta does all of a sudden have the climate of Chicago, you can still survive there. Certainly, people do survive in Chicago right now. So I'm saying that under a lot of circumstances, there's going to be a lot of places on this planet that you're still okay, as long as you've got food.
Well, we'll go back to the modern minimum for a moment. The stories, let's start with the lithographs that they had of the glaciers growing and advancing in Switzerland. This is a really famous lithograph. Well, they had the priests up there throwing holy water on it to try to make it go back into the mountain. This is the same time that they were burning witches. And, even over here, I did a video talking specifically in Salem and a couple areas there that had, when the wheat harvests were good, there were less witch trials. When the wheat harvest was incredibly bad for those couple years in the late 1700s, witch trials went right back up again. It was crazy. the correlation, and in Europe as well, the harvest and the witch trials had a definite tag to them, where the better the wheat harvest, the less witch trials. The worse the wheat harvest, the more witch trials. But growing glaciers, on your website, Iceagenow.info, I come here frequently because I believe that it's going to take a culmination of everybody's wisdom into this whole change, into this colder climate. And it's going to take everybody's resources combined to put a playbook together where we're going to move forward. But even on the left side, you're talking about the categories here. We got growing glaciers, not just in the U.S., but down in New Zealand as well. And then just today, Australia is receiving, snow, and it's 2 months early for the snow to start, with frost as well, right near the capital. But Mallee, that same area, southern Australia, right there on the border, they had some difficulties over the last couple of years growing grains. So it's already showing stress fracture points in Australia to lose part of their grain production as well. And how many harvests can you go until our staples declines year upon year? And what kind of economic stress will that have? What if you're paying 3 times more for your food, 5 times more for your food? Then what?
Antarctica,
what's going
which
on?
is, it's down there on the bottom of the globe, and most people don't realize how big it is. Antarctica is twice as big as the contiguous United States, and the ice is growing in Antarctica. Nobody bothers to mention that. Well, Antarctica contains 90% of the world's ice. So if the ice is growing in Antarctica, that means that 90% of the world's ice sheets are growing. But all we hear about is the ones that are melting. Yeah, the glaciers in New Zealand had been growing, then they pulled back for a little bit, and now I just posted last month that they're growing again. We hear about that the Himalayas, that the ice was going to be gone by 2035, but as a matter of fact, the glaciers in the Himalayas are growing. Glaciers are growing on Mount Everest. They're growing on K2. They're growing on Nanga Parbat. Glaciers are growing. Glaciers are growing. The biggest glacier in Chile is growing. The biggest glacier in Argentina is growing. Glaciers are growing in the United States, and I've got a feeling that probably most people who are listening to this from the United States aren't even aware of that. But Mt St Helens, if anybody remember Mt St Helens, it erupted, 1980, I think it was. But Mt St Helens, before it erupted, was covered with huge ice sheets. And during the eruption, they melted almost instantaneously, and so you had huge floods running down the Toutle River that included bulldozers and trees, uprooted trees, and melted ice, everything. Well, that was in 1980. Now a new glacier has started forming inside the crater. It's called Crater Glacier. And that glacier is now bigger than the ice was in 1980 when Mt St Helens originally erupted. Glaciers on Mount Baker in Washington State are growing. Glaciers on Mount Shuckson are growing. I've received word from somebody who lives near Glacier Peak that is growing, the glaciers there. So there's a lot of answers that we're just not hearing the truth, as far as I'm concerned.
I'd like to throw a number out there as well. Antarctica, with the vast, incredibly large size that it is, how many temperature stations do you think are on that entire continent that they keep feeding us again and again? Oh, it's warming, it's warming, it's warming.
207. And that covers an area twice as big as the United States.
Oh, but they can get it within a tenth of a degree and tell you that it's, it warmed 100th of a degree. It's
because of the underwater volcanic activity. I'll bet that all 200 of those stations are near the ocean. So again, they're not getting a true picture of what's the truth. Yeah, and of course, we used to have all sorts of temperature stations in the Soviet Union, but when the Soviet Union collapsed, those stations stopped reporting, so we have to guess on what that is. And I think in Africa right now, the latest map that I saw shows Africa warming, and yet a different map from NOAA admits that they have They don't have the stations there. So yeah, it's all interpolation based on whatever somebody wants the numbers to turn out to be. But sometimes I can't blame the scientists. The state climatologist of Oregon, he wouldn't toe the global warming line, so he was fired. The state climatologist of Virginia wouldn't toe the global warming line, so he was fired. The state climatologist of Delaware wouldn't toe the global warming line, so he was fired. Well, if you're a young scientist just starting out and you've got a mortgage and you've got a wife and or a husband, and you've got kids that you got to feed, and you see that your boss got fired, I think you're going to learn to keep your mouth shut pretty quickly. So I don't call it a conspiracy. I guess I call it survival. I understand why they probably don't talk about global cooling as much as they should.
There's a lot of people asking, they should go to jail, and they're finger pointing and this and, these trials and all these. Well, okay. It's science. We need to kind of put that in the past and say that just didn't work, because what's coming for us and our global civilization is about to reset in so many ways. It's truly at the point of resetting right now. And this is the main driver that they don't want to talk about, because I think it would cause a global panic. Truly, it would. If you were to come out and talk about everything, and if every citizen on the planet knew as deeply as you and myself what is coming.
And I don't agree with putting the scientists who are saying the other things in jail. I think that, if you were brought up in the last 40 years and going to school, that's what your teachers have taught you, and it's called, I think it's called confirmation bias. But once you believe something, then you just see the confirmation. I bought a Honda CRV. I had no idea how many there were until I bought one, and now every time I drive down the street, I see Honda CRVs that I swear weren't there before. So, we can blind ourselves very easily without it being a conspiracy.
And I'll wind up with one last point here. We've been talking about the magnetosphere and the electromagnetic connection from the Earth to the Sun. There's one last little piece in there, the solar wind. The primer field on our sun is coming down into a phase state shift, which is going to stop our solar wind. It's going to come down to almost zero solar wind around 2030 or so. And at this point, that's the missing factor that's going to cause our magnetosphere to even weaken and split and expand further than it would be. It's going to go to the weakest point, and there'll be no solar wind pressure pushing it back on our planet to try to compress it in any way, shape, or form. This is kind of the wild card here. The decline is not only going to be with the total solar irradiance with less TSI coming off, and the media focuses on TSI all the time. That is just one single tiny little piece of the entire equation when you're talking about effects from the sun on our climate. TSI, I don't even know if it has that much of an effect dropping temperatures. Perhaps, some temperature drop, I'll agree, yes, but it's not the main driver. You got all the particulates in the atmosphere, you got just things changing all over the place, cloud covers increasing. TSI will have its effect. But moving forward, what do you see as a timeline going out to these more major changes?
Well, I remember first full-fledged radio interview about this, and I went on record as saying that we would be admitting within 20 years that we were in an ice age. Well, not many people are admitting that, and yet earlier I had mentioned the astrophysicists, Piers Corbin out of London and Habibullah Abdusamatov out of Russia. They are admitting that we are in a mini ice age right now. So I don't know how soon this is going to happen, but I'm very concerned about the next 10 years. So, yeah, your number of 2024, I would not be surprised.
Dr. Abdusatov's work, Pulkovo Observatory, they have that forecast that they put out with the solar cycles coming down. The amount of sunspots, and John Casey's been talking about the same thing you are. Hey, sea level's not going up. It's going to start decreasing, and along with the decrease in the sunspots, and there's a direct correlation of sunspots, solar activity, and the climate on our planet. And past cycles, population migration. Where are all these people going to move to this time? In the Maunder Minimum, there were not nearly the amount of people. There was just barely at 1 billion people on the planet. Now we have almost 8 billion. Where is everybody going to go to? Not everybody can run to the equator with their retirement savings. Countries are going to start locking their borders when this happens. They're not going to let people in.
Even a little ice age is catastrophic. During the little ice age in England, the rainy season, I mean, England didn't get covered with ice by any means, but the rainy season persisted for 2 to 3 weeks longer in the spring, so farmers weren't able to plant until later. And then the rainy season returned 2 to 3 weeks earlier in the fall, and the crops were destroyed. Literally millions, and I mean that, millions of people died of starvation. And so I could foresee that happening again. There's not going to be as many people moving south as want to, because they're not going to have the food. And yes, there's going to be those fights over the borders. That wall that somebody may build between the United States and Mexico, it may end up keeping people from the United States moving to Mexico. It's a conundrum, and I do not know the answer. I do not advise waiting for your government, whatever country you're living in. I do not advise waiting for your government to acknowledge the problem or to solve the problem.
And Robert, just one last question. Greenland's growing in the ice, and you've seen the charts these last 2 years, the year before last record ice, 2016, with the ice mass budget on the surface increasing in ice. In your opinion, is this another indicator that it's turning cooler in some of the ice, and the ice gain is returning back to some of the initial seed points?
Yes, I think we're seeing the beginning.
Well, that's a deep statement. And Robert, I thank you so much for your time. I've been wanting to talk to you for a while and putting some of my videos up on Iceagenow.info, and I appreciate that, to try to share the information. And it all does come down to it. The easiest explanation is the way to explain it better.
I think we're on the same page on this, and the more we can do to get the word out, I think the better it is.
All right, and you've been listening to David DuByne and Robert Felix, author of Not by Fire But by Ice and Magnetic Reversals and Evolutionary Leaps. Also, the website Iceagenow.info with the latest following the changes in our climate, in the cooler weather that we're experiencing, and the other knock-on effect in our society. I appreciate your time, Robert. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.